The day I started my new job as a camp counselor, I knew something was off. The camp was nestled deep in the woods of Oregon, far from any signs of civilization. The air was crisp and cool, but there was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't shake. As I walked through the campgrounds, I noticed the old cabin near the lake, its windows boarded up, its roof sagging under the weight of years. During our first meeting, the head counselor, Mark, laid out the rules, and one, in particular, stood out. Never enter the cabin after sunset. It seemed odd, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just some local superstition. That night, after the campers had gone to bed, I sat by the fire with a few of the other counselors. The night was calm, the stars bright above, but there was tension in the air, a silence that hung heavy around us. The other counselors were friendly enough, but I couldn't help but notice how they avoided looking toward the cabin. When I asked about it, they changed the subject, their smiles strained. I decided to let it go for now, but my curiosity was piqued. As the fire burned low, I heard it for the first time, a faint noise coming from the direction of the cabin. It was soft, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I glanced at the others, but no one seemed to notice. Maybe it was just my imagination. But as the night wore on, the noise grew louder, more persistent, like a distant voice calling out. The unease I felt earlier returned, stronger now, tugging at the edges of my mind. Something was not right about this place. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the conversation around the fire. But the noise kept creeping back into my thoughts, gnawing at my curiosity. What was in that cabin? Why was it off limits after dark? I could feel my pulse quicken as the urge to find out grew stronger. But I pushed it down, reminding myself that it was probably just an old building with a creaky roof or some animal making a home inside. As I lay in bed later that night, the sounds of the camp quieting around me, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. The darkness outside felt oppressive, the silence almost unnatural. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, trying to sleep, but the thought of the cabin wouldn't let me rest. I knew I had to find out what was going on. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start asking questions. The next morning, I made it a point to listen closely during breakfast, hoping to overhear anything that might shed some light on the cabin's mystery. The counselors were friendly, but there was an underlying tension in their conversations, a careful avoidance of certain topics. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, I caught snippets of a hushed conversation between two of the senior counselors, Beth and Tom. They were discussing something about the cabin, their voices low, their expressions uneasy. I pretended to be engrossed in my breakfast, but my ears were tuned to every word. "She was last seen near the cabin," Beth whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "No one knows what happened to her. It's like she just vanished." Tom nodded, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "We should have told the new girl about it," he muttered, but Mark insisted it would just scare her. My heart skipped a beat as I realized they were talking about me. The unease I'd felt since arriving at the camp deepened into a cold dread. That afternoon, I tried to focus on my duties, but the conversation replayed in my mind over and over. A counselor had gone missing near the cabin, and now I was here, being kept in the dark. The other counselors seemed more distant today, their smiles less genuine, their laughter forced. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like an outsider, like I was being excluded from some dark secret everyone else knew. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a familiar sense of unease creeping in. The sounds from the cabin began again, soft at first, but growing louder as the night wore on. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was more distinct, like a voice, a plea for help. My heart raced as I stood by the fire, my eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the cabin in the distance. The urge to investigate was almost overwhelming, but the memory of Beth and Tom's conversation held me back. What if there was something dangerous in that cabin? Despite my fear, I knew I couldn't just ignore it. The thought of the missing counselor haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow connected to whatever had happened. The other counselors kept their distance, casting uneasy glances at me, as if they knew I was close to crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. The tension was palpable, and I knew I couldn't go another night without knowing the truth. Finally, I made up my mind. I would go to the cabin just to see what was there. Maybe it was nothing, just an old, abandoned building with a bad reputation. But I couldn't live with the fear gnawing at me, the unanswered questions swirling in my mind. As the fire died down and the others began to drift off to bed, I stood up, my decision made. Tonight, I would find out what secrets the cabin held. With a flashlight in hand, I made my way toward the cabin. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. Each step I took seemed to echo in the stillness, the crunch of leaves underfoot unnervingly loud. As I got closer, the cabin loomed larger, its dark silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. The windows were still boarded up, the door slightly ajar, as if beckoning me to enter. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and determination driving me forward. I hesitated at the threshold, the rule about not entering after sunset echoing in my mind. But something deep inside me, a gut feeling I couldn't ignore, pushed me to step inside. The cabin was shrouded in darkness, the beam of my flashlight barely piercing the thick gloom. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and decay. The wooden floor creaked under my weight, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. The room was empty, save for a few old pieces of furniture covered in dust, long forgotten. As I moved deeper into the cabin, my flashlight caught something on a dusty table in the corner. I approached it slowly, my breath catching in my throat when I realized what it was: an old, weathered journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly as I opened it. The handwriting was frantic, scrawled across the pages with an urgency that made my heart race. It was a diary, and as I read the first few lines, I realized it belonged to the missing counselor. The entries were filled with fear and confusion, recounting strange events that had occurred during her time at the camp. She wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows that shouldn't have been there, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread whenever she was near the cabin. The last entry was the most chilling. It described a night much like this one, when she heard something calling her to the cabin. She had come here, just like I had, drawn by an inexplicable force. But unlike me, she hadn't made it out. My blood ran cold as I read the final line. It's here with me, in the dark. If you're reading this, leave now, before it's too late. A shiver ran down my spine, and I nearly dropped the journal in my haste to back away. But before I could move, a soft, pleading voice broke the silence, coming from somewhere deeper in the cabin. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was unmistakable, a cry for help. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave. Not now. I had to see who or what was in the cabin. My flashlight flickered as I followed the sound, the beam wavering as I approached a door at the far end of the room. The door was old, but it was locked. The voice on the other side grew more desperate, and I felt an overwhelming need to open the door, to find whoever was trapped inside. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, my fear mounting with each passing second. Finally, with a loud creak, the door swung open, revealing the darkness beyond. As the door creaked open, the darkness seemed to swallow the weak beam of my flashlight. I hesitated for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest, before stepping into the room. The air was thick, with an overwhelming sense of sorrow and despair, as if the very walls were steeped in misery. The faint voice that had guided me here was silent now, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I swept the flashlight across the room, searching for any sign of the source of the voice. The room was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture and dusty boxes that hadn't been touched in years. The walls were lined with shelves, all empty save for a few cobweb-covered trinkets. But it was the corner of the room that caught my attention. There, in the dim light, I saw a figure, a young woman, barely visible, her form ethereal and ghostly. She was huddled on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, as if she had been waiting for someone to find her. My breath caught in my throat as I realized who she was, the missing counselor. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a deep sadness, yet there was a glimmer of hope in them too. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, as if she was too weak to speak. I stepped closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and I could see her more clearly now. She was dressed in the same uniform I wore, but her clothes were torn and faded, her skin pale as death. She seemed to be trapped in some kind of limbo, caught between worlds, unable to move on. I knelt beside her, my heart aching for the torment she had endured. The journal had warned me, but now I knew I couldn't leave her here, not like this. The entity that haunted the cabin had kept her imprisoned, feeding off her fear and despair. But something told me that my presence here was weakening its hold, that I could help her if I stayed strong. I reached out, my hand passing through her cold, translucent form, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, pain, loneliness, and a desperate need for release. The air around us seemed to pulse with energy, the very fabric of the room trembling as if the cabin itself was fighting back. But I didn't waver. I focused all my thoughts on helping her, on breaking the entity's grip on her spirit. I could feel the darkness closing in, but I refused to let it take her. The room grew colder, the walls closing in, but I stayed where I was, refusing to back down. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the tension in the air lifted, the oppressive weight dissipating like a heavy fog. The woman looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with gratitude, and then she began to fade, her form dissolving into the air. A soft, peaceful smile crossed her lips as she disappeared, her spirit finally free. The room around me felt lighter, the darkness retreating, leaving only the dim glow of my flashlight. I stood up, feeling a strange sense of calm, as if a great burden had been lifted. The cabin was silent now. I knew then that whatever haunted this place had been defeated, its power broken. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door open behind me. The cabin no longer seemed threatening, just old and abandoned, like any other forgotten building in the woods. As I stepped outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, bathing the camp in a soft, golden glow. I took a deep breath, feeling the fresh morning air fill my lungs, and knew that I had done the right thing. The morning light washed over the camp, dispelling the last remnants of the night's darkness. As I walked back toward the main campgrounds, the weight of what had happened in the cabin began to lift. The air was fresh and cool, the scent of pine needles and damp earth grounding me after the surreal experience. The camp was slowly coming to life, the sounds of birds chirping and the rustling of leaves replacing the eerie silence of the night. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, knowing that the terror that had plagued the camp was finally over. When I reached the main lodge, I found Mark, the head counselor, already up and about preparing breakfast. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "You were out early," he remarked, trying to keep his tone casual, but I could sense the underlying worry. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before speaking. "I went to the cabin," I confessed, watching as his eyes widened in surprise. "I know you said not to, but I had to know what was really going on." Mark's face paled, but he listened intently as I recounted everything that had happened. I told him about the journal, the voice, and the trapped spirit of the missing counselor. His expression grew more serious with every word, and by the time I finished, he was shaking his head in disbelief. I never imagined it was something like that," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We all knew something was wrong with that place, but we were too afraid to face it." I nodded, understanding now why the counselors had been so distant, so cautious around the cabin. "But it's over now," I said, feeling a sense of finality in the words. "She's free, and whatever was holding her there is gone." Mark looked at me with a mix of gratitude and guilt. "We should have done something sooner," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But now that we know, we can finally put it to rest." Later that day, Mark gathered the other counselors, and we made the decision to demolish the cabin. It wasn't an easy choice. There was history in those old walls, and it felt like erasing a part of the camp's past. But we knew it was the right thing to do, to prevent anyone else from being drawn into the darkness that had consumed the place for so long. The demolition crew arrived the next morning, and we all watched as the cabin was torn down, piece by piece, until nothing was left but an empty clearing by the lake. As the last of the debris was cleared away, I felt a deep sense of closure. The camp was no longer haunted by the shadows of the past. It was free to be a place of joy and memories once more. The counselors and I shared a quiet moment of reflection before returning to our duties, the atmosphere lighter and more peaceful than it had been since I arrived. That night, as I lay in bed, the sounds of the camp settling around me, I finally felt at ease, knowing that the story of the cabin had come to a fitting end. In the days that followed, the camp was filled with laughter and the carefree energy of summer. The shadow that had hung over the place was gone, replaced by the warmth of new beginnings. I couldn't help but feel proud of what we had accomplished, of the courage it took to face the unknown and come out the other side. And as the summer went on, the memory of that night became a distant echo. I started my new job as a night security guard at the camp in the Appalachian Mountains on August 21st, 2022. The camp, surrounded by dense forests, was serene during the day, but as night fell, the atmosphere changed. There was a stillness in the air that felt unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath. The camp director, Mr. Harris, was a gruff man with little patience for questions. He handed me a flashlight and a set of keys. His instructions brief: patrol the grounds, keep an eye on the cabins, and most importantly, never patrol the woods past midnight. At first, I didn't think much of the rule. It sounded like a precaution, something to keep the campers from wandering off and getting lost in the vast wilderness. But as the night wore on, the silence of the woods became more oppressive. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, were conspicuously absent. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked the perimeter, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. By the third night, I had grown accustomed to the routine. The campers were always asleep by the time I started my rounds, and the only company I had was the occasional owl hooting in the distance. But that night, something felt different. As I made my way past the dining hall, I noticed a faint light flickering in the distance, deep within the woods. It wasn't the soft glow of a lantern or the steady beam of a flashlight. It was an unnatural, almost ethereal light that pulsed faintly between the trees. Curiosity got the better of me, and despite Mr. Harris's warning, I decided to investigate. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a camper had snuck out with a flashlight, or one of the other staff members was playing a prank. But as I moved closer to the edge of the woods, the light seemed to retreat, drawing me deeper into the forest. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and excitement pushing me forward. I knew I shouldn't be out here, but something about that light was irresistible. The deeper I went into the woods, the more disoriented I became. The trees seemed to close in around me, the branches tangling above to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping unnaturally fast. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, and the light, now just a faint glow in the distance, continued to lure me further from the camp. I paused for a moment, considering turning back, but the thought of leaving without uncovering the source of the light was unbearable. I took a deep breath and pressed on, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand as I stepped deeper into the unknown. The light continued to flicker just out of reach, drawing me deeper into the forest. The path beneath my feet became uneven, the ground soft and damp, as if the earth itself was warning me to turn back. But I couldn't stop now. The further I walked, the more I felt a strange pull, as if the light was guiding me, beckoning me towards something hidden within the woods. The silence was absolute, and even the sound of my own footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the darkness that surrounded me. As I pushed forward, the trees grew denser, their twisted branches forming an almost impenetrable barrier. I had to squeeze through narrow gaps, my clothes catching on the rough bark as I struggled to keep the light in sight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and every breath felt heavier, laden with the weight of the forest's secrets. The light, though faint, never wavered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was leading me somewhere I was meant to find. Suddenly the light vanished, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart skipped a beat, panic rising in my chest as I realized how far I had ventured from the camp. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam flickering weakly before stabilizing. The light's absence left an eerie void, and I felt a chill creep up my spine as I realized I was alone in a part of the woods I didn't recognize. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight revealing only trees and shadows, no sign of the path I had taken. Desperation set in as I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift around me, the trees closing in tighter with every turn. My sense of direction was gone, and the oppressive silence made it impossible to think clearly. I called out, my voice swallowed by the dense foliage, the sound barely reaching beyond the nearest trees. There was no response. It was as if the forest had absorbed the light and sound, leaving me stranded in a world that was entirely its own. Just as I was about to give up and return to the camp, assuming I could even find my way back, I saw it again. A faint glow, this time closer, almost within reach. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat in the darkness, and despite my fear, I felt drawn to it once more. With a deep breath, I steeled myself and took a step toward the light, my pulse quickening as I prepared to uncover whatever lay ahead. The mystery of the light was far from over, and I was determined to see it through. The light was closer now, so close that I felt I could reach out and touch it. But as I stepped forward, it moved again, slipping just beyond my grasp. Frustration mingled with the fear gnawing at my insides, but I couldn't turn back, not when I was this close. The light pulsed rhythmically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees, their twisted forms seeming to reach out for me as I passed. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in the faint glow. I followed the light deeper into the forest, the ground beneath me becoming uneven, almost treacherous. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the thick darkness in weak spurts. Every so often, the light would disappear, plunging me into complete darkness, only to reappear moments later in a different spot. It was as if the forest itself was playing a twisted game, and I was its unwilling participant. My hand shook as I held the flashlight, trying to keep the beam steady, but my nerves were frayed. As I ventured further, the light led me to a small clearing, the trees opening up to reveal an old, decrepit shack. The structure looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, its wooden walls warped and decaying. The light hovered near the entrance, casting an unnatural glow that seeped through the cracks in the weathered wood. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every step. I knew I shouldn't go inside, but the light left me no choice. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. Inside, the shack was eerily empty, the air thick with dust and decay. The light now rested in the center of the room, illuminating a strange symbol carved into the wooden floor. The symbol pulsed with a faint, ominous glow, and as I stepped closer, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It was as if the very air was alive with malice, and I was intruding on something I was never meant to see. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but the light's pull was too strong. It beckoned me closer, urging me to examine the symbol. My breath hitched as I knelt beside it, the glow intensifying as I reached out a trembling hand. The symbol seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, and as my fingers brushed the surface, a sudden wave of cold washed over me, freezing me in place. The light dimmed, and in that moment, I realized that I had gone too far, that whatever this was, It wasn't meant to be disturbed. As my fingers touched the symbol, the air around me seemed to ripple, the temperature plummeting to an unbearable chill. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was as if some unseen force was holding me in place, compelling me to stay. The light, now dimmed to a faint glow, pulsed weakly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. My heart raced, the fear clawing at my chest as I struggled against the invisible force that held me captive. Suddenly, the shack was filled with a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The symbol beneath my hand grew warmer, almost searing to the touch, and I could feel a strange energy coursing through it. My head began to spin, the room around me warping and twisting, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of some immense power. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The oppressive silence pressed down on me, and I felt as though I was drowning in it. Just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the force holding me in place suddenly released its grip. I fell backward, gasping for air, my hand throbbing with pain where it had touched the symbol. The light, now barely more than a flicker, began to fade completely, leaving the shack in almost complete darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my instincts screaming at me to get out, to run as far away from this place as possible. But as I turned toward the door, I felt a presence behind me, something watching, something waiting. I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. The light had vanished completely, leaving me alone in the dark. I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the latch. The door seemed heavier than before, as if something was pushing against it, but I managed to wrench it open and stumble out into the cold night air. Outside, the forest was deathly still, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The path I had taken was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and I had no idea which direction led back to the camp. I could feel eyes on me, unseen but undeniable, and every instinct told me to run. I broke into a sprint, the branches whipping at my face as I plunged back into the forest. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was right behind me, just out of sight. I ran through the forest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the branches clawed at my clothes and skin. The path was impossible to find, the darkness around me impenetrable, and the sense of being pursued grew stronger with every step. I could hear something behind me, not quite footsteps, but a soft rustling, as if the very shadows were alive and following me. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out all other sounds, and the only thought in my mind was to escape, get back to the camp, to safety. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in tighter, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the faintest light. My flashlight flickered, its beam weakening until it finally died, leaving me in complete darkness. I stumbled, nearly falling, as the ground beneath me became uneven, treacherous. I tried to orient myself, to find some sense of direction, but it was useless. The forest was a labyrinth, and I was hopelessly lost within it. In the distance, I thought I saw a faint glow, another light, like the one that had led me into this nightmare. But this light was different, colder, more malevolent. It flickered ominously, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I realized it was coming closer. I turned away, my heart racing, and continued to run, my legs burning with the effort. The light followed, relentless, drawing nearer with each passing moment. It was as if the forest itself was driving me toward it, forcing me to confront whatever lay ahead. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I tumbled down a steep embankment, landing hard on the rocky ground below. Pain shot through my leg, but I forced myself to stand, the fear of what was behind me overriding the pain. I looked around, desperate for any sign of the camp, but there was nothing, just darkness, and the faint, cold light creeping ever closer. My heart sank as I realized there was no way out, no escape from whatever was stalking me. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the approaching light, until my back hit the rough bark of a tree. The light stopped just a few feet away, hovering in the air, pulsating with a strange, unnatural energy. I could feel its cold gaze on me, though I couldn't see what was behind it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light winked out, leaving me in absolute darkness. The forest was silent once more, and I was alone. Or was I? I never found out, as the story ends here, leaving the mystery unresolved. The true nature of the light and whatever was behind it left to linger in the dark.